The cattle came first. That was how it always happened at Redemption Crossing. You heard the thunder of hooves before you saw the dust cloud. And by the time the dust cloud rose high enough to blot out the morning sun, there was no longer any question about who was coming. Theresa Callahan stood her ground at the center of the narrow timber bridge, her boots planted wide on the weathered planks, her right hand resting on the wooden post of the toll gate as though she had grown there like an oak. She did not step aside. She did not reach for the lever that would lift the crossbar and let the first of the longhorns rumble through. She simply waited, her dark auburn hair whipping across her face in the hot Kansas wind, her jaw set like quarried stone. The rider at the front of the herd pulled up short, his horse rearing slightly at the abrupt halt, and the 1,000-pound animal between his knees snorted foam onto the sun-cracked earth. He was exactly as they had described him at every saloon, trading post, and sheriff's office between Abilene and the Oklahoma Territory. Gideon Hawkins. 6 feet and 3 inches of weathered fury, with a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who believed beauty was a weakness. He wore a black trail duster that was caked with 2 weeks of red dirt, and his eyes were the color of a sky that had made up its mind to storm. He stared at her from the back of his horse. She stared back. Behind him, 1,200 head of Texas longhorns shifted and bawled, pressing forward, the whole restless mass of them a living wall of beef and horns and hot breath. 3 armed trail hands fanned out behind their boss, hands loose near their holsters, reading the situation the way men read a weather vane. "Move the gate," Gideon Hawkins said. His voice was low, but it carried. It always carried. Men had moved mountains on the strength of that voice. "Pay the toll," Theresa Callahan said. Not a single word more. Not a please, not an explanation, not a nervous qualifier. Just those 3 words, steady as a heartbeat. The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room, or in this case a crossing, with something that felt almost like electricity before lightning strikes. Gideon Hawkins had driven cattle across 9 crossings that season. He had argued down 4 toll keepers, intimidated 2 more into backing away entirely, and at one crossing outside of Dodge, a man had simply taken one look at the approaching herd and left his post without a word. Nobody stood at a toll gate and told Gideon Hawkins to pay. Nobody who knew his name, and everybody within 300 miles knew his name. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, and the question was quiet, almost curious, the way a man asks something when he already knows the answer and is wondering if you do too. "I know exactly who you are," Theresa said. "You are a man with 1,200 head of cattle who has not yet paid his crossing fee. That is all you are to me right now, Mr. Hawkins. $4 a hundred head, $48 total. Cash or certified bank draft." One of the trail hands let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Gideon did not look at him. He did not look away from Theresa. This was the moment that everything in both their lives had been quietly, inexorably building toward, though neither of them could have known it then. The moment that would unravel secrets neither had intended to share, force choices neither had wanted to make, and drag both of them out of the dark pasts they had built their walls around, blinking, furious, and terrifyingly alive. It had started 6 weeks earlier, and it had started with a lie. Theresa Callahan had arrived in the small settlement of Barlow Bend, Kansas, in April of 1876, on the back of a freight wagon loaded with dry goods, and a trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. She was 27 years old, which was considered by the polite standards of the era to be firmly on the far side of marriageable, and she had opinions about that characterization that she kept mostly to herself. She had come west from St. Louis on the strength of a letter from the Barlow Bend Land and Commerce Association, which had advertised for a toll keeper at Redemption Crossing, the only viable bridge crossing on the 40-mile stretch of the Cimarron River that served the cattle drives heading north to the rail yards at Abilene. The letter had promised a small salary, a toll keeper's cabin on the riverbank, and a percentage of collected fees. It had not mentioned that the previous toll keeper, a man named Howard Pringle, had abandoned his post after receiving what the association's chairman, a damp-handed man named Gerald Fitch, described vaguely as a strongly worded visit from someone he declined to name. It had not mentioned that the crossing served several $100,000 worth of cattle traffic per season, and that several powerful men in the region had very specific ideas about how that money should and should not flow. It had not mentioned Gideon Hawkins. Theresa had taken the post anyway. She had her reasons, and they were not small ones. She had left St. Louis with a hidden motive that she had not shared with the Land and Commerce Association, and she would not have shared it with anyone who asked, because the truth of why Theresa Callahan had come to Barlow Bend was something she carried close to the bone, in that tight, locked place behind the sternum where people store the things that have hurt them most. Her brother, Patrick Callahan, had come west 2 years before her. He had written faithfully for 14 months, long chatty letters full of the wild beauty of the prairie and his plans to buy land near the Cimarron. Then the letters had stopped. The Land and Commerce Association's correspondence address was the last known location anyone had for Patrick Callahan, and Gerald Fitch's name appeared twice in Patrick's final letter, in a context that had troubled Theresa enough that she had read that letter 40 times in the 2 years since it arrived. So she had taken the toll keeper's post. She had come to find her brother, and she had come wearing the most effective disguise available to a woman in 1876, which was not a disguise at all. It was simply competence. Men consistently failed to look past it. The cabin at Redemption Crossing was small but solid, one room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and a covered porch that faced the river. The bridge itself was 60 feet of good timber construction, wide enough for a wagon or a small herd, narrow enough that nothing moved across it without coming through the toll gate first. The gate was a simple crossbar mechanism on an iron pivot, which a single person could raise or lower with a lever. The fee schedule was posted on a painted board beside the gate in clear black letters. Theresa had spent her first week at the crossing learning the mechanisms, taking stock of what supplies were on hand, introducing herself to the small community of Barlow Bend a half-mile up the road, and asking quiet, careful questions about Patrick. The answers she got were careful too, cautiously careful, the kind of careful that told her the people she was asking were afraid of something. The second week, the cattle drives had started coming through. Small ones at first, local ranchers moving stock to summer pasture. Theresa collected their fees and recorded them in her ledger with the precise handwriting of a woman who had worked for 3 years as a bookkeeper in St. Louis. She was pleasant. She was firm. She did not give credit, she did not negotiate fees she had not set, and she did not once step back from that gate until the fee was paid. By the end of the 3rd week, she had collected more in toll revenue than the crossing had brought in during the entire previous month under Howard Pringle, a fact she recorded in a separate private ledger she kept under a loose floorboard in the cabin, because she had a feeling that accounting discrepancies were part of what had happened to her brother. Gerald Fitch had come to visit her in the 3rd week, ostensibly to check on how she was settling in, actually to look at her ledger. He was a narrow-shouldered man in his 50s with the soft hands of someone who had never done physical work and the eyes of someone who had done other kinds. He had looked at her numbers, said nothing directly, complimented the neatness of her handwriting, and left in a way that felt more like a withdrawal than a departure. She did not trust him. She had not trusted him from the first letter. In the 4th week, she had found something in the woodpile behind the cabin. It was a small oilskin packet tucked into a gap in the stacked logs, and inside it was a folded piece of paper in her brother's handwriting. It was not a letter exactly. It was more like notes, written in the cramped style of a man recording things quickly and in secret. Numbers, names, dates. Gerald Fitch's name appeared 4 times. The name of a local judge appeared twice. And there was a 3rd name written with a question mark beside it as though Patrick had not been sure how to place him. Gideon Hawkins. She had stared at that name for a long time. She had then folded the oilskin packet and put it back under her own floorboard, beside her private ledger. And she had sat by her fire that night and thought carefully about what it meant to find your brother's handwriting in a hidden place without finding your brother. She was still thinking about it when the dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon 6 weeks after her arrival, and the thunder of 1,200 longhorns brought Gideon Hawkins to her gate. He had not paid, not that first day. He had sat on his horse and stared at her in what she could only describe as genuine bewilderment. And then, when it became clear that she was not going to move and he was not going to pay, he had wheeled his horse around and driven his cattle to the riverbank a mile downstream where they could water, and he had made camp there for the night. Theresa had gone back inside her cabin and locked her door and sat down at her table and breathed very carefully for several minutes, because her hands were shaking and she was furious at them for it. She told herself the shaking was anger. She was not entirely sure that was true. The next morning he came back. Without the herd this time, just him and his horse, and the morning light hitting the river behind him in a way that was genuinely unfair, and he knocked on the door of her toll-keeper's cabin with 3 firm knocks and waited. She opened the door. "I'd like to talk," he said. "About paying the toll?" she asked. "About the toll in general," he said. She let him in, because information came in all forms and she was still looking for her brother. And Gideon Hawkins's name had been in her brother's notes with a question mark. She needed to know which side of the question mark he was on. He sat at her table with his hat in his hands and his trail duster open, and she made coffee because she had been raised to offer hospitality even when she had misgivings, and she sat across from him with her own cup and waited. "I have driven cattle to Abilene for 8 years, he said. "I know every crossing between here and the Red River. I know what the fees are, and I know what they're supposed to be used for." This crossing's fees were supposed to go to the bridge maintenance fund and a percentage to the keeper's salary. That is not what has been happening. Theresa said nothing. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "The man who had this post before you," Gideon continued, "was collecting fees and handing over only a portion of what he collected to the association. The rest was going somewhere else. I know this because I paid my fees, cash on the barrel, and I have receipts in my saddlebag that show amounts larger than what appears in the association's posted records." "And you know about the association's posted records because?" Theresa asked. "Because I asked to see them," he said. "I'm a man who drives significant cattle value across this bridge every season. I have a right to know how my money is being used. When I looked at those records, the numbers didn't match my receipts." He paused. "That is why I refused to pay yesterday." "You didn't refuse to pay," Theresa said. "You refused to negotiate. Those are different things. The fee is set. I didn't set it, I collect it." "You collect it and hand it over to Fitch's association," he said. "I collect it and deposit it at the Barlow Bend Bank in the crossing account," she said. "I record every transaction. Would you like to see my ledger?" He looked at her then in a way that was different from how he had looked at her the day before. The day before it had been the look of a man confronting an obstacle. This was something else, something more attentive. "You keep your own records," he said. "I keep my own records," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the river moved over its stones with its usual indifferent music. A meadowlark called from the cottonwood on the east bank. "What brought you here?" he asked. "Employment," she said. Which was true as far as it went. "Where are you from?" "St. Louis." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. His hands were extraordinary things, she noticed, trying not to notice. Large and hard-worked and precise in their movements. The hands of someone who had spent decades managing animals and rope and weather. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mrs.," she said, which was a lie she had deployed on purpose, because single women at remote outposts in 1876 needed all the social protection they could manufacture. There was no Mr. Callahan. There had never been a Mr. Callahan, but the title was a useful fiction, and she used it without guilt. Something shifted in his expression, very briefly. Then it settled back into its weather-carved neutrality. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "there is more going on at this crossing than a fee dispute. I want you to know that because you are sitting in the middle of it whether you knew it when you took this post or not." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. That stopped him. "You know. I know there are discrepancies in the association's records. I know the previous toll keeper left under circumstances that weren't entirely his choice. I know that Gerald Fitch has interests that extend beyond legitimate association business." She paused. "I know quite a bit, Mr. Hawkins. I have been keeping records." He stared at her for a long moment. The morning light through the window was doing something warm and complicated to the color of his eyes, and she made herself look at her coffee instead. "Why?" he asked. Not an aggressive why, almost a wondering one. She stood up and refilled her coffee cup and thought about how much to say, and decided on something close to the truth without being all of it. "Because someone I care about came through this area and disappeared, and I believe the records of this crossing have something to do with it. I am gathering evidence." Gideon Hawkins sat very still. "Who disappeared?" "My brother," she said. "Patrick Callahan. He came west in 1874. He was writing to me regularly and then he stopped. His last letter mentioned this crossing and mentioned Fitch." The look on Gideon Hawkins's face changed in a way she could not entirely decode. It went through several things rapidly: recognition, something like pain, and then a careful blankness that was worse than either. "You know something," she said. It was not a question. He stood up and put his hat on. "I need to move my cattle. I'll pay the toll. Mr. Hawkins." He was at the door. "Gideon Hawkins," she said, and his name in her mouth stopped him the way a hand on the arm would have. "If you know something about my brother, you will tell me. Whatever it costs you, whatever arrangement you have with whoever you have it with, you will tell me." He stood with his hand on her door frame and his back to her, and she watched the muscles of his shoulders move under his duster as he breathed. "Not today," he said finally, "but I will come back. I will be here," she said. "I am always here." He paid the toll, $48 cash exact. He counted it out on her porch rail, and she wrote him a receipt with her careful handwriting, and watched his 1,200 head of longhorns thunder across the bridge, the whole earth trembling under the weight of them. Then he rode north with his cattle, and the dust swallowed him, and she stood on her porch until the dust settled, and the river got quiet again. She pressed the receipt he had handed back to her for her records between the pages of her ledger, and told herself the warmth she felt was simply the relief of a standoff peacefully resolved. She did not entirely believe that either. He came back 17 days later. Same black duster, same storm-colored eyes, but a different quality to him, less armored somehow, or armored in a different way, like a man who has decided to do something he is not sure he should do and has gotten past the deciding and into the doing. He was alone this time. No cattle, no trail hands, just him and his horse in the late afternoon light that turned the Cimarron to hammered copper, and he knocked on her door again with those 3 firm knocks. She was expecting him. She had been expecting him, though she had not admitted it to herself, and the 3 knocks made her heart do something undignified that she pretended had not happened as she opened the door. "Sit down," she said. "I have coffee." He sat. She poured. He set an envelope on the table between them. "Your brother is alive," he said. She sat down fast because her legs required it. "Where?" "Colby Station. It's a supply depot about 60 miles west of here." "He's been there for 8 months, working under a different name." He paused. "He ran, Mrs. Callahan. He found out what Fitch was doing and he tried to report it to the county judge, and the judge is in Fitch's pocket, and someone warned Patrick that he was going to be arrested on manufactured charges, so he ran." Theresa's hands were flat on the table. She was watching them to make sure they stayed flat. "What is Fitch doing?" "The toll money," Gideon said. "The crossing fees from this bridge, and from 2 others Fitch controls through the association. He has been skimming a significant portion of those fees for years and funneling the money to a land speculation scheme. He's been buying up parcels along the proposed railroad extension route using money that legally belongs to the county infrastructure fund." He turned the envelope so it faced her. Your brother had documentation. That's what's in that envelope. She stared at it. How did you get this? Patrick trusted me with a copy before he ran. Gideon's voice was level, but something under it was not. He knew I had been suspicious of the fee discrepancies. He came to me because I was the only person he could think of who was both aware of the problem and not under Fitch's influence. A brief pause. That's why my name was in his notes. I wasn't certain when I came here the first time whether you knew that or not, whether Fitch had sent you. Theresa looked up sharply. You thought I might be working for Fitch. I considered the possibility, he said, with the bluntness of a man who does not dress up the truth for the sake of manners. A woman arrives at a crossing that has been a source of financial irregularities, takes over a post that has been essentially a conduit for Fitch's operations, keeps extremely precise records. Either she was sent by Fitch to tighten up the operation, or she was here for her own reasons. I needed to determine which. So your refusal to pay the toll at the bridge was a test, she said slowly. A test of how you reacted under pressure, he confirmed. A person placed here by Fitch would have found a way to accommodate me, because my cattle represent significant fee revenue and Fitch would not want to alienate a major customer over a principle. I held my ground, she said. You held your ground, he said, and something in his voice when he said it was different from the statement's literal content. Warmer. Quieter. Like a man who has spent a long time in a world that does not hold its ground and has been unexpectedly moved by encountering something that does. She opened the envelope. Inside were pages of Patrick's precise handwriting, rows of figures and names and dates that told a story of sustained, calculated betrayal. Gerald Fitch had been stealing from the county infrastructure funds for at least 4 years. The total was not small. She turned the pages carefully, reading everything twice, feeling the shape of it solidify from suspicion into documented fact. Why didn't you take this to someone? She asked. You've had this for 8 months. He was quiet for a long moment. Who would I take it to? The local judge is compromised. The county sheriff takes his campaign contributions from the association. The federal marshal's office is in Wichita, which is not a quick ride, and I had no certainty that whatever I submitted would not be quietly buried before it reached anyone with both authority and independence. He paused again, and this pause had more weight to it. I also had a dark past of my own, Mrs. Callahan, that made me reluctant to draw official attention. I have spent considerable effort in the last several years putting distance between myself and things I am not proud of, and presenting documentation of someone else's wrongdoing to federal authorities involves a degree of exposure I was not prepared to risk. She looked up at him. He was looking at the table at his coffee cup, not at her. It was the first time she had seen him not looking directly at whatever was in front of him, and it made him look briefly, startlingly human. What kind of dark past? She asked, because she was a woman who asked the question people were hoping you would not ask. I ran with a rough company when I was younger, he said. Before I had the ranch, before the cattle drives, I was not on the right side of several things. He looked up then, and the storm in his eyes was personal weather, not performance. I am on the right side now. I have been for a long time, but records exist. Are you telling me this so I know where you stand, she said, or so I know where you have been? Both, he said, because I think you are about to do something brave and possibly dangerous, and if I am going to be involved in it, you should know who you are involving. She looked at him across the table for a long moment. The river moved outside the window. The cabin walls held the warmth of the late afternoon sun. Are you offering to help me? She asked. I am telling you what I know and giving you the documentation your brother collected, he said. What you do with it is your decision. But you would help if I asked. Another long pause. He looked at his coffee again. Then back at her. Yes, he said simply. The thing that happened then inside Theresa's chest was not something she had a precise name for. It was not gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. It was more like the sudden awareness of not being alone in something she had been carrying alone for 2 years, and the awareness had a physical weight to it, a gentle seismic settling, like ground that has been under pressure for a long time finally finding a stable configuration. "Then I would like to write a letter to the Federal Marshal's office in Wichita," she said, "and I would like you to tell me how to get word to my brother that he can come out of hiding." "I can do both those things," Gideon said. They worked at her table until the sun went down. He knew Patrick's location and method of contact to relay through a freighter he trusted, and he knew enough about the federal marshal's jurisdiction to help her frame the letter appropriately. She wrote, and he reviewed, and occasionally suggested different phrasing, with the careful precision of a man who had learned from experience how official language could be turned against its author. At some point she lit the oil lamp on the table, and the warm circle of its light closed around them in the way that lamplight always does, pulling the world down to the size of two people, and a table and the work between their hands. She noticed the way he held his pen, which was wrong, the grip of someone who had taught himself late rather than being taught young. She noticed the scar on his left hand, a long pale line from the base of his thumb to his wrist. She noticed that he smelled of horses and wood smoke and something else, cedar maybe, and that when she passed the ink bottle to him, their fingers came within an inch of each other, and she was aware of that inch in a way that was disproportionate to its physical significance. She did not examine these noticings. She filed them carefully in the category of irrelevant observations and kept writing. He left when the letter was finished and sealed. He would send it through his own contacts in Abilene, through channels he trusted, with a notation requesting a response be sent to him at his ranch on the Sweetwater rather than to the crossing, which was too exposed. He would also send word to Patrick. He stood on her porch in the dark and put his hat on and said good night, and she stood in the lamplit doorway and said good night, and it was a perfectly ordinary exchange that felt somehow like considerably more than that. "Mr. Hawkins," she said as he stepped off the porch. He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back." "I said I would," he said. "A lot of men say things," she said. "I know," he said. And he rode away into the dark, and she stood on her porch for a while listening to the river and trying to be sensible about what she was feeling, with limited success. 3 weeks passed. The summer drives intensified, and Theresa collected fees and kept records and watched the road north and south with the attentiveness of a woman waiting for several things at once. Gerald Fitch came by twice, both times with the manner of a man who wanted to look at her books and could not quite bring himself to ask directly. Both times she was pleasant and efficient and gave him nothing. On the 15th day after Gideon had left, a letter arrived from the Federal Marshal's office in Wichita. Theresa read it 3 times at her kitchen table with her hands very still, and her heart beating in an inconveniently pronounced way. The letter acknowledged receipt of the documentation, confirmed it had been reviewed by a deputy marshal named Harlan Cross, and indicated that an official inquiry was being opened. It requested that she preserve all relevant records and indicated that Deputy Marshal Cross would be traveling to Barlow Bend within the month. On the 22nd day, Gideon Hawkins came back. He came in the afternoon this time, and this time when she opened the door before he knocked, because she had heard his horse while it was still 100 yards out. Something in his expression changed briefly in a way she was beginning to learn to read. It was a small thing, a slight relaxation around the eyes, but she had spent enough time in the company of people who controlled their faces for professional reasons to know what a controlled face looked like, and she knew that very small, unguarded moments in such faces were more honest than entire paragraphs in less defended ones. He was glad to see her. "Patrick got the message," he said on the porch. "He's coming." The sound she made was not entirely dignified. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a second, and Gideon stood there and let her have the moment without filling it with words, which was one of the things she would later identify as one of the things she loved about him, though she was not using that word yet, not even to herself. "When?" she managed. "He's traveling carefully. A week, maybe 10 days. He paused. "He'll come to me first at the Sweetwater. I'll bring him here." "Why to you first?" "Because the road through Barlow Bend goes past the association office," he said. I'd rather not have Patrick walk past Fitch's front door. My ranch approaches from the west." She nodded. This was sensible. She knew it was sensible. She was also aware that his instinct had been to protect her brother before the thought had even fully formed as a plan, and that awareness did something to her that she was filing aggressively in the irrelevant observations category. "Come in," she said. "I have something to show you." She showed him the letter from the federal marshal's office. He read it standing at her table, and when he looked up his expression had something in it that she could only call relief, but a deep and personal relief, the kind that comes not just from news going well but from a pressure that has been building for a long time finding somewhere to go. "That's good," he said. "That's a very good thing." "It is," she agreed. "Sit down, I'll make coffee." "You are always making coffee," he said, and it came out differently than he intended, warmer, amused, like something a man says when he is comfortable enough to say what is in his head rather than what is appropriate. He looked slightly startled by his own tone. She took considerable private pleasure in that. They talked for 2 hours, not about Patrick or Fitch or the federal marshal. Gradually, without a specific decision being made, the conversation moved to other things. He told her about his ranch, the Sweetwater operation, 700 acres of good grassland on the Sweetwater Creek with a stone house he had built himself over 3 years, a small crew of hands he trusted, a breeding program for cattle that he had developed with some precision and more than some pride. She told him about St. Louis, about the bookkeeping work, about her father who had died when she was 22 leaving her and Patrick to manage on their own, about the particular quality of independence that comes from necessity rather than choice. "You came here entirely alone," he said, "to a remote post, to a situation you knew was potentially dangerous." "I came here for my brother," she said. "It was not complicated." "Most people would have found it very complicated," he said. "Most people had someone else to send," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You are one of the most stubborn people I have ever met," he said, in a tone that indicated this was not a criticism. "I prefer the word determined," she said. "I imagine you do," he said, and there was that slight relaxation around his eyes again, and Theresa Callahan, who had been sensible about large things for her entire adult life, felt the particular helplessness of falling for someone she had not planned to fall for, and recognized it with the resigned clarity of a woman who has been honest with herself for long enough to know what honesty costs. She was not going to say anything about it. He had a dark past he was cautious about. She had a fiction of a husband, and she was in the middle of a federal inquiry with her brother in hiding and a corrupt official potentially watching her crossing. This was not the time. She walked him to his horse in the late afternoon gold of the Kansas summer, and she shook his hand on the front porch, firmly and professionally, and thanked him again for his help with Patrick, and he held her hand for one moment longer than a handshake required, and then he let go and got on his horse and rode west. She looked at her hand. She went back inside and made supper and was very severe with herself for the rest of the evening. 8 days later, Patrick Callahan arrived. He came riding in from the west in the early morning on a horse that was not his own, looking thinner than she remembered, and older than 2 years should have made him, but with the particular alive-eyed quality of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has just been told the fear might have an end. He came into the yard of the toll-keeper's cabin, and she was on the porch before he got off his horse, and she crossed the yard in 6 steps and he caught her, and they held on to each other in the dusty morning yard for a long time without saying anything. Gideon stood back. He had brought Patrick, as promised, riding quietly through the back ways and the creek crossings, and now he stood by his horse at the edge of the yard with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a private man watching a private moment, respectful of what he was witnessing. When Patrick finally let her go and stepped back with wet eyes he was making no effort to hide, he looked past her at Gideon. "She's exactly what I told you," Patrick said. "Isn't she?" Gideon looked at Theresa, and she felt the look even with her back partly turned. "She is," he said simply. Patrick looked between them and said nothing further, but the small knowing smile on his face was something Theresa chose not to examine. They spent 3 days together at the crossing, the three of them, while Deputy Marshal Harlan Cross completed his travel from Wichita. Patrick reviewed the documentation with Theresa, supplementing it with what he remembered, filling gaps and explaining connections. Gideon proved to have a precise and retentive memory for financial details, and could recall dates and amounts from his own receipts with the accuracy of a man who had spent years in quiet, private suspicion, and had been keeping his own mental records. In the evenings they sat on the porch and talked, or around the table with the lamp between them, and Theresa watched her brother watch her watch Gideon without entirely meaning to. And she wished, not for the first time, that private feelings were less visible to people who loved you. On the second evening, Patrick contrived to run out of tobacco and to remember he had left something in his saddlebag at precisely the moment that Gideon was on the porch alone, and Theresa, who saw exactly what he was doing, found herself standing in the doorway of her own cabin with the unreasonable sensation of a woman who has been managed by her younger brother. She stepped out onto the porch. Gideon was leaning on the railing looking at the river. The night was warm and the stars over the Cimarron were the extravagant western variety, layered and deep, and the sound of the water was steady and indifferent and beautiful. "He is very transparent," Theresa said, coming to stand at the railing a few feet away. "He cares about you," Gideon said. "He is meddling." "People who care do that," he said, and something in his voice was careful in the way it had been careful in the early days when he had still been deciding things. She was quiet for a moment, watching the river. A night heron passed low over the water, dark and purposeful. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. "I should tell you something." He turned to look at her. "My husband," she said and paused. "There is no husband. I told you I was a Mrs. when you first came here because I thought it would be safer. I am not married. I have never been married." The silence after that was long enough to hold several things. Then he turned back to the river. "I know," he said. She stared at him. "You know." "Your brother mentioned it," he said, "the first time I spoke with him. He told me you had almost certainly deployed the Mrs. Callahan strategy, as he called it. He seemed to think it was a reliable habit of yours." She was going to have several pointed words with Patrick in the morning. "And you said nothing. It was your information to share when you chose to," he said. "It was not my business to push." A pause. "Though I will admit it changed the nature of certain thoughts I had been having." She turned to look at him fully now. He was still watching the river, and the starlight was doing something to the planes of his face that was, she decided, absolutely unreasonable. "What kind of thoughts?" she asked. He looked at her then, and the storm in his eyes was a different kind of storm from the one she had seen at the gate that first morning. Warmer, more dangerous, in a way that had nothing to do with cattle or toll gates. The kind that involve a woman who would stand in the middle of a bridge in front of 1,200 longhorns and not move an inch, he said quietly. And the question of whether a man with my particular history could reasonably expect a woman like that to consider him worth her time. Theresa Callahan had been practical her entire life. She was practical now. She said, very clearly and without decoration, "I would consider it worth my time to find out." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him truly smile, not the controlled near expression of a guarded man, but an actual full smile, and it transformed his face in a way that was devastating in the best possible sense. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years," he said. "I am an honest person," she said. "It sometimes makes people uncomfortable." "Not me," he said. "Not in the slightest." Patrick came back from the saddlebag shortly after that, with a suspiciously long return time, and found them still at the railing, talking, close enough together that the distance between them was no longer the formally maintained several feet it had been. He said nothing. He was very badly hiding a smile. Theresa decided to let him have this one without comment. Deputy Marshal Harlan Cross arrived on the fourth day with 2 assistants, a warrant, and an expression of professional satisfaction at the state of Theresa's documentation, which he described as the finest private accounting record he had encountered in 15 years of federal service. The inquiry into Gerald Fitch's activities moved with a speed that was unusual for official proceedings, which Theresa attributed both to the quality of the evidence and to the fact that a significant amount of county money was involved, and missing county money had a way of motivating official urgency. Gerald Fitch was arrested on a Friday morning at the association office in Barlow Bend. Theresa watched from a distance, not out of satisfaction exactly, but with the particular settled feeling of something that has been wrong for a long time being brought back into alignment with what is right. Patrick stood beside her. Gideon stood on her other side. Neither of them said anything. The 3 of them stood there in the morning sun and watched justice take its first, careful step forward, and that was sufficient. The judge, whose involvement had been more passive than active, he had received money and asked no questions rather than actively participated, resigned from the bench under a cloud that would follow him west, and a new judge was appointed by the territorial circuit. Patrick gave his testimony to Deputy Marshal Cross in a 4-hour session at the Barlow Bend Bank building that left him pale and quietly shaken, but fundamentally intact. When he came out, Theresa was waiting with coffee from the hotel across the street, and he drank it in one long grateful swallow and said, "It's done." And she said, "Yes, it's done." And they stood there in the afternoon sun while the weight of 2 years lifted. The settlement of these matters took the better part of 3 weeks, during which Gideon came and went with the quiet reliability of a man who has decided where he wants to be and is making no particular secret of it. He testified to Deputy Marshal Cross himself, a day of careful accounting that he navigated with the precision of someone who had thought about it for a long time, and Cross treated him with the respect due a cooperative witness who had come forward voluntarily, which was a better outcome than Gideon had allowed himself to expect. During these weeks, things between Gideon and Theresa developed with the particular momentum of feelings that have been carefully contained for too long, not rushing, not reckless, but steady, like a river finding its course through new terrain. He brought her things, books from Abilene because she had mentioned she was short of reading material, a better oil lamp because he had noticed the one she had was smoky, a small wooden box he had made himself at his ranch during what Patrick reported was a period of conspicuous distracted carpentry. She received these things with a directness that matched his directness, thanking him plainly and without false modesty, asking after his cattle and his operation with genuine interest, telling him things about her own days and her thoughts without the elaborate social hedging that the era encouraged women to employ. He told her more about his past. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way trust is built when it is built well, not through dramatic confessions, but through the gradual accumulation of small, honest disclosures. He had ridden with a rough outfit in his 20s in New Mexico territory. He had done things he was not proud of that stopped short of the worst things but were not entirely distinguished either. He had made a decision at 29 to take everything he had earned, honestly and otherwise, and buy land in Kansas and build something real, and he had spent the 8 years since building it and becoming, through sustained effort and deliberate choice, the man he wanted to be rather than the man his early years might have predicted. "I do not regret telling you," he said, on an evening when they were sitting by the river on a fallen cottonwood with the late light going golden over the water. "I did not know how you would receive it." "How did you think I might receive it?" she asked. "Many women would not want a man with that kind of history," he said. "I am not many women," she said. "No," he said, with that quiet warmth she was no longer trying to file in the irrelevant category. "You are not. What you were is not what you are," she said. "What you are is what matters. I judge people by what they do when they have choices, not what they did when they were young and had fewer of them." He looked at her in the golden light. "Where did you come from?" he said, and it was not quite a question, more the quiet expression of something he was still slightly in awe of. "St. Louis," she said. He laughed, and she found that she liked his laugh almost as much as she liked his smile. "I have never been to St. Louis," he said. "You are not missing much," she said. "Though the river is very fine." "I have a river," he said, gesturing at the Cimarron. "You do," she agreed. "It's a good one." They sat by the river in the warm evening until the stars came out, and it was exactly what it was, which was two people who had found each other through circumstance and stubbornness and unlikely trust, sitting in the dark beside running water and feeling the future shifting pleasantly under their feet. Patrick, who had decided to stay in Kansas rather than return to St. Louis, there was work to be done rebuilding the association on honest terms, and he had applied for the position of association secretary, with Cross's strong endorsement, had taken a room at the Barlow Bend Hotel, and spent his evenings with pointed tact declining to return to the crossing cabin. On an evening in late August, with the summer heat just beginning its reluctant retreat toward fall, Gideon came to the crossing and sat on the porch with Theresa, and after a silence that contained rather a lot, said plainly and without decoration, "I would like to court you properly, Theresa, if you are willing." She thought she knew what she was going to say before he said it, and she was right. "I am willing," she said. "I should tell you something first," he said. "Something else. Something specific." He turned his hat in his hands. "I have a ranch and a cattle operation that requires my presence through most of the year. I am not a man who can live at a distance from his work for very long. What I am trying to say is that if this comes to what I hope it comes to, I would want you near me, at the Sweetwater. Which means I am aware that I am asking you to consider giving up a post that you have worked very hard to make your own, and I want you to know that I am not asking you to give up your independence. I am asking you to bring it with you, because I have never in my life met a person I wanted beside me, and I would not want you to be something other than exactly what you are." Theresa looked at him for a long time. The lamp on the porch rail was making the same warm circle it always made, and the river was doing its indifferent beautiful thing behind them, and she thought about St. Louis and the bookkeeping office and the 2 years of worry over Patrick and the moment she had stood on this bridge and refused to move. "I have been running this crossing for 4 months," she said. "It is a good post, and I have done good work here. But I did not come here for the post. I came here for my brother, and that is resolved." She looked at him steadily. "I am a person who needs useful work, Gideon. I am not someone who can sit still. If I come to the Sweetwater, I will need something to do. The Sweetwater operation has never had anyone who could keep accounts properly," he said. "My records are a disgrace. I know what the cattle are worth and what I paid for the land and roughly what I spend on supplies, but the detail is poor and I am aware of it." "I could manage accounts," she said. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. She stood up. He stood up. They were on the porch in the lamplight and the sound of the river and the August stars, and she crossed the 2 feet between them and put her hand on the lapel of his trail duster and looked up at him and said, "Then I think we understand each other." He covered her hand with his. His hand was very warm and very certain. "I think we do," he said. He kissed her then, and it was exactly the kind of kiss that is given by two people who have been paying very close attention to each other for months, which is to say it was both surprising and completely inevitable. And when it ended, they stood in the lamp circle on the porch by the Cimarron River, and she rested her head against his chest for a moment and listened to his heartbeat, which was reassuringly steady, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and it was quiet and warm and entirely right. Patrick, when informed the following morning, displayed absolutely no surprise whatsoever, and bought a round of drinks at the Barlow Bend saloon for everyone present in celebration, which Theresa heard about second-hand, and responded to with the resigned affection of a woman with a meddling brother, who is nevertheless very glad her brother is alive and well and meddling. The formal courtship lasted through the fall. Gideon had been right that the era required a proper form, and they gave it that form without chafing at it, because Both of them were people who understood the value of doing things correctly when you had decided to do them. He came to the crossing regularly. They attended the Barlow Bend church together. They rode out into the late fall prairie with its enormous sky, and the grass going gold and the first cold edge coming into the air. He showed her the Sweetwater Ranch on a clear October day, the stone house with its wide view of the creek and the cottonwoods and the rolling grassland going to the horizon, and she stood on the stone porch and looked at it and felt something in her chest open like a window. "It needs curtains," she said. "It does," he agreed. "And those kitchen shelves are incorrectly positioned," she said. "They are too high for anyone of a normal height to reach the upper ones without a stool." "They are," he said. "I can fix that." "I was hoping you would," he said. She turned around and looked at him with the ranch and the creek and the October sky behind him and said, "Gideon, I am going to marry you." He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "I believe the traditional arrangement involves me asking." "Then ask," she said. He laughed, that full open laugh she loved, and then he stepped toward her and took both her hands and asked her, with a seriousness that undercut none of the humor that had preceded it, to be his wife. She said yes with the same directness she had said everything else, and he picked her up briefly, and she laughed against his shoulder, and it was perfect. They were married in November of 1876 at the Barlow Bend Church, in a ceremony that Patrick attended with the expression of a man whose world has been put right. Deputy Marshal Cross, who had finished his Fitch inquiry and was returning north, stopped in Barlow Bend for the occasion because he had taken a strong personal liking to both the Callahan siblings and he enjoyed a wedding. The small church was full of ranch families and townspeople who had come to respect Theresa in her months at the crossing, and several of the regular cattle drive crews who had paid their tolls across that bridge, and told the story of the woman who had stood down Gideon Hawkins in various saloons from here to Abilene with considerable admiration. Theresa wore her best dress, which was practical wool in a dark blue that suited her auburn hair, and she walked down the aisle on Patrick's arm and looked at Gideon at the altar, and he was looking back at her with an expression of unguarded openness that she suspected he would have died rather than show anyone who had not earned it, and she had earned it, and she held it as carefully and as permanently as anything she had ever held. The minister performed the ceremony with appropriate dignity. When he got to the part about lawfully wedded wife and asked if Theresa took this man, she said, "I do," in the same steady, clear tone she had said everything at every toll gate and every confrontation and every moment of consequence in her life, and Gideon smiled beside her, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They moved to the Sweetwater Ranch in December. Theresa brought her trunk and her ledgers and her practical determination and her absolute refusal to be decorative when she could be useful, and she settled into the stone house on the creek with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who had been looking for a home without knowing she was looking. The kitchen shelves were repositioned in the first week. Curtains appeared in the second. A comprehensive accounting system for the Sweetwater operation appeared in the third, and Gideon, reviewing it, shook his head slowly and said, "I have been losing money on the Abilene contracts for 2 years without knowing it." And she said, "I know, I can see it in the supply expenditures." And they sat at the kitchen table together and fixed it, and it was the kind of domestic collaboration that is not romantic in any obvious sense but is in every real one. Patrick came for Christmas and stayed for 2 weeks, and the three of them were together in the stone house on the Sweetwater with a fire and food, and the particular happiness of people who have been through a dark passage and come out the other side. Patrick reported that the Reformed Association was functioning well under his secretaryship, that Fitch's trial had been set for the spring and was expected to result in conviction, and that he had met a schoolteacher in Barlow Bend named Clara who had very nice eyes and who had agreed to walk with him on Sunday afternoons. Theresa received this news with enormous pleasure and told him Clara sounded wonderful, which she gathered from Patrick's transparency was accurate. Gideon shook Patrick's hand and said something quiet to him that Theresa did not hear and that Patrick clearly appreciated. And she loved Gideon for that in the specific way you love a person for being good to the people you love. The winter on the Sweetwater was deep and white and beautiful in the way that only the high Kansas prairie is beautiful in winter, with the sky pressing low and the creek frozen at the edges, and the cattle visible from the porch as dark shapes against the snow. Theresa learned the rhythms of ranch life, which were different from any life she had lived before, organized around animals and weather and the slow, vast rotations of the agricultural year. She found she liked it with a directness that surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. She had always been a person who needed something real to do, and ranch life was nothing if not real. Gideon was a patient teacher of everything she did not know, which was most of the practical work, and she was a fast learner, which he pointed out with the honest appreciation of a man who respects competence as something in itself, rather than as something unusual in a woman. She learned to ride with improved confidence. She learned the cattle, their individual temperaments, and the management systems Gideon used. She learned the accounts already, of course, and expanded them into a full financial picture of the operation that Gideon described as revelatory in the best possible way. In the evenings they read or talked, and she discovered that under the controlled exterior and the weather-carved face was a mind that she genuinely loved spending time with, a mind that had read widely in the way of self-educated men on the frontier, with large gaps and surprising depths, and that held opinions formed from observation rather than received wisdom. He asked her things. He listened to her answers. He disagreed with her sometimes, and they argued with the particular vigor of two people who are not afraid of the friction because they trust the underlying thing. She told him things she had not told anyone. He told her things in return. The reciprocal honesty of it was a daily small gift, and she valued it as such. In the spring, Gerald Fitch was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 1 count of misappropriation of public funds. He was sentenced to 7 years at the Kansas State Penitentiary. Theresa and Patrick attended the trial together, sitting in the courthouse gallery with the careful composure of people watching a conclusion. When the verdict was read, Patrick let out a long, slow breath, and Theresa reached over and pressed his hand, and neither of them needed to say anything. The new tollkeeper at Redemption Crossing was a man named Abel Torres, a steady-tempered former freighter recommended by Patrick and approved by the Reformed Association. Theresa had helped train him before she left the post, passing on her record-keeping system in full, and she heard from Patrick that he was running the crossing well and that the bridge maintenance fund was, for the first time in years, actually growing. She felt good about that. She had not been only passing through. She had left something better than she found it, and that mattered to her in a way that was connected to why she had come west in the first place. Not just for Patrick, though that was the catalyst, but because she had always been a person who needed the world she lived in to be arranged properly, and arranging it required getting involved. Spring became summer on the Sweetwater. Gideon drove his cattle north to Abilene in June, as he did every year, and Theresa ran the ranch in his absence with 2 of the most senior hands, a weathered man named Walt Dearborn who had been with Gideon for 6 years, and a younger man named Santos who had come north from Texas 2 years back and was becoming indispensable. She managed them well and they respected her, which was partly because she was the boss's wife and partly because she demonstrably knew what she was doing, and she preferred the second reason. Gideon was gone 6 weeks. She missed him with a specificity that was different from how she had expected missing someone to feel. It was not a generalized longing, but something precise and particular. She missed the sound of his voice at the dinner table. She missed arguing with him about the account books. She missed the way he came to stand beside her at the porch rail in the evenings and looked at the creek with her in a shared quiet that felt more intimate than a great deal of speech. She wrote him a letter, long and detailed, and was pleased when a reply came through Abilene, written in his self-taught pen with the careful language of a man composing something meant to last. When he came back in July, trail-dusted and road-worn and carrying himself with the particular tiredness of 6 weeks' hard work, she was on the porch when he rode in, and he got off his horse and came across the yard, and she went down the porch steps to meet him, and he held her for a long moment without saying anything, and she thought, with the simple clarity of certain truths, that this was the right life. In the fall of 1877, Theresa realized she was expecting their first child. She told Gideon on a September evening by the fire, plainly and directly as she told him everything, and the expression on his face was one she would keep in a private place in her memory for the rest of her life. It moved through surprise and something very close to fear, and then into a kind of open, wondering happiness that he made no effort to contain, and he crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" With an attentiveness that meant something particular about the kind of father he was going to be. She said she was feeling very well, thank you, which was mostly true. She said she was not delicate, and he should not treat her as such. He said he was not treating her as delicate. He was treating her as someone carrying the most important thing that had ever existed, and she thought about arguing the point on feminist grounds and decided it was too endearing to argue with. Patrick came when the baby arrived in April of 1878, making the ride from Barlow Bend in a hurry because Gideon had sent word, and arrived to find Theresa sitting up in bed with a newborn son and an expression of absolute authority. The baby was a boy, which Gideon received with the quiet reverence of a man who had not been certain. He deserved this, and was not going to take it lightly. They named him James Patrick Hawkins, the second name for the uncle who arrived wind-blown and emotional and sat by the bed, and told the baby with great sincerity that he was very much wanted. James Patrick Hawkins was a solid, interested infant who regarded the world from his first weeks with the attentive dark eyes of someone paying close attention. He grew into a boy of sturdy opinions and considerable energy, and Theresa raised him on the Sweetwater with both the honest practicality of her own upbringing and the wide sky and working land of the ranch, which produced a child who was both thoughtful and physical in equal measure. Patrick married Clara Benton, the schoolteacher, in the summer of 1878, 3 months after James was born. Theresa attended the wedding with the baby on her hip and Gideon beside her, and it was the kind of day that is ordinary in scale and immense in meaning. Clara was everything Patrick had suggested with his transparency, which was to say she was kind, intelligent, steady, and quietly amused by her new husband's enthusiasms, which was exactly the right response to Patrick. Gideon liked Clara immediately, which Theresa noted and appreciated. He was not a man who warmed to people quickly, and the fact that he warmed to Clara within the first conversation told Theresa something both about Clara's quality and about how far Gideon had come from the guarded, armored man who had sat across her table 8 months earlier and told her a carefully edited version of his past. He was not that man anymore, not because he had changed in his foundations, but because he had stopped defending against things that were not threatening him. The dark past was still there, a fact of his history, but it had stopped being the most important thing about him, which was how it should be for a man who had done the work of becoming something better. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full. Not without difficulty. There were hard winters and difficult cattle seasons, and the ordinary frictions of two strong-willed people sharing a life, which they navigated with the same directness that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. But the difficulty was held inside something larger and more solid, the way a storm is held inside the sky without reducing the sky. A daughter came in 1880, a winter baby born in a January snowstorm with the creek frozen to the bank, and Walt Dearborn making his 3rd trip to the door to ask if there was anything needed. And she was named Eleanor Me Hawkins, after nobody in particular, because Gideon said she looked entirely like herself and deserved a name of her own. She was born with an expression of calm consideration that she maintained for the rest of her childhood, watching her older brother's noise and energy from a composed distance, and occasionally intervening with decisive efficiency when he went too far. Gideon adored both children with an intensity that he wore, unusually for him, without armor. It was one of the things that had surprised her most about him as a father, that a man who had spent so long building walls around himself was entirely open with his children, patient in the long way rather than the performative way, present in the specific way of someone who had thought carefully about what he had not had and had decided to build the opposite. His own history was not something he discussed in detail, but she had gathered enough over the years to know that his childhood had not been gentle, and that the ranch and the stone house and the life on the Sweetwater were in some ways the life he had been trying to reach since before he knew he was trying to reach it. She thought about that sometimes, on the porch in the evenings with the creek going its way and the light doing its daily impossible thing over the Kansas grassland. She thought about how Patrick's disappearance, which had been the worst 2 years of her life, had brought her here. How Fitch's corruption had been, in its roundabout way, the mechanism by which she had found this particular wide sky and this particular solid man and this particular right life. She was not a person who believed in fate exactly. She was too practical for that. But she believed in the specific way that paying attention to the world opens doors that looking away would keep closed, and she had always paid attention, even when it was difficult, even when the crossing was full of 1,200 longhorns and one very stubborn cattleman who was not going to pay the toll. Especially then. In 1881, the railroad extension that Fitch had been speculating on arrived in the region, passing north of Barlow Bend, along a route that was, Deputy Marshal Cross noted when he visited the following year with considerably more gray in his hair, about 3 miles from several of the parcels Fitch had illegally purchased. Cross took a dim view of this and investigated whether anyone else had picked up those parcels after Fitch's conviction, which led to another set of irregularities that were eventually resolved in a manner satisfying to the rule of law, though less rapidly than anyone would have liked. The arrival of the railroad changed the character of the cattle drives. Shorter drives became more common, with cattle loaded at closer rail depots, and the great northward runs to Abilene began their long, slow decline. Gideon had anticipated this, partly through conversations with Theresa about the account books and the trajectory of freight rates, and he had been shifting the Sweetwater operation toward breeding quality stock for local and regional markets rather than depending on the long drive to the railhead. It was the right call, and it positioned them well through the middle 80s as other operations struggled with the changing economics. Theresa ran the accounts through all of it, and did it with the same precision she had brought to the toll-keeper's ledger in that first April at Redemption Crossing. She expanded the records over the years to include feed costs, breeding records, equipment maintenance, land management, and a careful tracking of regional market prices that gave Gideon information he used to time his sales with considerably better results than he had managed on instinct alone. He told her once, on a fall evening with James asleep in the loft and Alina in her cradle and the fire low, that the Sweetwater in its current form was as much her work as his. She said that was an exaggeration, and he said it was not, and they argued about it pleasantly for a while, and then he said that regardless of whether it was an exaggeration, what he meant was that he could not imagine the ranch or the life without her, and that was not an exaggeration at all. She said she knew. She said she could not imagine it without him either. She said it with the plainness that characterized all her true feelings, no decoration, no disclaimer, just the simple, honest statement of a thing that was simply honestly true. He kissed her temple and they sat by the fire, and outside the Kansas night did its enormous quiet thing over the grassland, and it was peaceful in the deep kind of way that only comes after a significant amount of difficulty. Patrick and Clara had 2 children of their own by 1882, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Ruth, and the families visited back and forth with regularity. Thomas and James were 2 years apart and got into the kind of companionable trouble that 2 boys of that age and proximity get into. And Alina and Ruth developed the alliance of slightly younger female cousins, who are managing the chaos created by their brothers with mutual solidarity. Gideon and Patrick had become, over the years, the kind of friends that start as allies and become genuinely fond of each other, very different men who found in each other something they respected. Patrick was open and social and enthusiastic, all the things that Gideon was not on the outside. And Gideon was steady and precise, and quietly deeply funny in ways that took time to discover, all things that Patrick appreciated more the longer he knew him. They argued about cattle prices and territorial politics, and occasionally about chess, which Patrick played badly and Gideon played well, and Patrick disputed the outcomes with a vigor that Gideon found entertaining. In the spring of 1883, Theresa rode back to Redemption Crossing for the first time since leaving it 6 years earlier. She rode with Gideon, a 2-day journey on the road east, stopping at Barlow Bend first to see Patrick and Clara. The toll-keeper's cabin had been expanded and improved under Abel Torr's stewardship, and the bridge had been reinforced and widened the previous year with county funds from the now honestly managed infrastructure account. She stood at the gate and looked at the bridge for a long time. The Cimarron moved beneath it in its usual indifferent way. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The painted fee board was freshly done, black letters on white, sharp in the morning sun. Gideon came to stand beside her. He did not say anything because he was a man who understood the weight of moments without needing to narrate them. "I stood here," she said, "and I was so frightened." "You did not look frightened," he said. "I know," she said. "I was very careful not to." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and they stood at the gate of Redemption Crossing in the bright spring morning, the toll-keeper's board behind them and the river below and the whole wide Kansas ahead. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Coming up against the gate and finding someone who didn't move. I have thought about that day every day since it happened," he said. "But regret is not the word I would use." "What word would you use?" He turned to look at her, this man with the weather-carved face and the storm-colored eyes that held now, in the spring light of 1883, something far steadier than storms. "Fortunate," he said. She smiled. He was not an extravagant man with words, and when he chose one, it meant exactly and completely what it said. She tucked that one beside all the others she was keeping. Abel Torres came out of the cabin and recognized her and shook her hand warmly and said the record system she had left him was still in use and that the new county auditor had praised it as a model. She said she was glad to hear it. He offered coffee. She said yes. They sat on the expanded porch of the toll-keeper's cabin, the 3 of them, drinking coffee in the spring morning, and Theresa Callahan Hawkins looked at the bridge she had stood on 6 years ago and thought about all the things that had come across it. The cattle and the commerce and the corruption and the consequences and the unexpected, unplanned, entirely unreasonable love. She thought about standing in the middle of that bridge with her boots planted on the weathered planks and her hand on the gate post, and 1,000 head of cattle coming toward her, and one man on a horse who was accustomed to people moving out of his way. She thought about what it had cost her to stand there, and what it had given her in return. She thought it was, on balance, the best thing she had ever done. On the ride home to the Sweetwater that evening, with the light going long and gold over the grass and the road home familiar under their horses' hooves, Gideon reached across the space between their horses and held her hand for a moment, briefly and simply, and she held his back. And the sky over Kansas was enormous and clear and full of the particular infinite quality that the western sky has in the golden hour. That quality of suggesting that the world is larger and stranger, and more generous than anything you have planned for. It was almost supper time when they came up the creek road and saw the stone house with lamplight in the windows, which meant Alina had lit the lamps as she was old enough to do now, and James had probably not helped, and supper was likely in a state of good intentions and moderate execution. Walt Dearborn would have fed the stock. The accounts were in order. The ranch was running as it should. Gideon put up the horses, and Theresa went into the kitchen and found exactly what she expected. Alina managing the cookstove with dignified competence and James reading by the window with the air of someone who had not thought about supper once. She kissed the top of Alina's head and told James to set the table and began adding to what Alina had started, and Gideon came in from the barn smelling of horses and hay and that cedar smell she had noticed the first time he was in her cabin, and he came to stand beside her at the stove and looked at what was cooking and said it smelled good. "It will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. "I can wait," he said. "You can help," she said. "Tell me what to do," he said. "There is bread in the box," she said. He got the bread. James set the table under his sister's supervision, which he bore with the resigned tolerance of an older brother, who had learned that Alina's supervision was ultimately in his best interest even when it was annoying. Gideon sliced bread and Theresa finished supper, and the lamp made its warm circle on the table, and outside the Sweetwater Creek ran over its stones in the late evening light, and the sky over the Kansas prairie held the last gold of the day in its enormous unhurried hands. They sat down together, the four of them, and Gideon said grace in his quiet, certain way, and James launched immediately into a detailed report about what Santos had done with the south pasture fence that afternoon, which he had apparently been waiting to deliver since before they arrived. And Alina mentioned that she had finished the book Theresa had given her and would like another, please. And Theresa said she would ask in Barlow Bend when they next went to town. And Gideon said Santos had done exactly right with the south pasture fence, and he would tell him so tomorrow. And outside, the cottonwoods moved along the creek, and the stars came out one by one over the Sweetwater, and the night settled in its deep plains quiet over the stone house and the good land, and all the people inside it who had found their way to each other through circumstance and stubbornness, and a toll gate that one woman had refused to open until justice and honesty and love had come through to the other side. It was everything, and it was enough, and it was the right life, and it was theirs.